Hello, book lovers, and welcome to another Inside the Cover Book Club, where every month we pick a book to read, but best of all, we get to interview the author of the book of the month. This month's selection in November reflects many tragic events that have and continue to affect the Jewish culture and their people. In the past, on November 9th and 10th in 1938, Nazi leaders unleashed a series of attacks against the Jewish population in Germany and recently incorporated territories. This event came to be called Kristnacht, meaning the night of broken glass. And this was because of the shattered glass that littered the streets after the vandalism and the destruction of Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues, and homes. Today, we are also very well aware of the recent war in Israel and the Gaza Strip. These are times of great horror and hate. But today's show reminds us that there are always stories of humanity and compassion in the midst of inhumanity and hate. So today's theme for the show could be called Finding Stories of Love in Times of Hate. I'm your host, Gil Rolon, and today's author for the month of November is Evelyn Grossman. Her book is titled Hidden in Berlin, a Holocaust memoir, Holocaust Survivor True Stories. First, let me tell you a little bit about Evelyn before we start the interview. She worked for many years in the financial world as an underwriter for commercial loans at the United Jersey Bank, which ultimately became Bank of America. She also worked as an analyst for commercial debt obligations at GMAC, General Motors Acceptance Corporation. Evelyn had a wonderful career in the financial industry, but she's retired now, and she was inspired to write a book about her family surviving during the Holocaust. We will learn more about Evelyn's life as we talk about her book. So Evelyn, I want to welcome you to the show. I want to thank you, and we definitely need your book because it reminds us that there are acts of love in times of hate. So why don't we start out with you telling us what really inspired you to write this book?
Well, first, Gil, thank you very much for inviting me to come here tonight. I'm looking forward to our conversation. We've talked a bit before, and I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation. You know, as a child, you hear bits and pieces of a story. Nobody tells you the story from A to Z. You just hear bits and pieces. So I knew a lot, but never put it all together. I think the decision to actually write the book came after a trip to Berlin in 1995 with my mom, and I was able to see the places she lived, and where my dad had passed away already, but I knew the addresses. We walked there, and I actually could see the place where my mom was in hiding and met her childhood friend who actually saved her. So seeing these people, and I didn't want the story to be forgotten. I wrote it primarily for my family, for children, grandchildren. But I'll tell you, after having written it, many people have either had not the similar experiences and have expressed gratitude. And I guess the original intent for the family was met, but it even fulfilled a bigger role than that.
Great. Yeah, so I could see how this book is so important. Why do you think we need more stories told about the Holocaust?
Well, this book came out about almost 3 years ago, and I always thought about this book as an important story of the past, of terrible things that had happened a long time ago, what we should remember, but not a story of today. Sadly, after October 7th, I see too many similarities, and it makes the book almost more relevant than it was initially. I think the things that are the main takeaways is that anti-Semitism exists and we need to be on guard for it, call it out when it is, keep dialogues going on with people. People tend to have silos, and then people fall apart and they don't communicate. That, I think, whatever reasons the Palestinians and the people in Gaza and Israel, I think the problem isn't so much there, but it's completely with Hamas, and that's the problem that Israel is fighting right now. So the book also talks about how my mother's family and my father's family were full Germans. They felt as much German as I, an American, a Jew, feels American. And so it came to them as a surprise, a disappointment. But there were signs, and things have to be watched. The other very, very important lesson from my story are 4 German people. They weren't Jewish. 2 of them saved my father, and 2 of the others saved my mother. My parents were not married during the war. They got married after the war. They knew one another, but there's really 2 separate stories in this book.
So tell me a little bit more about how these people risked their lives to rescue your family.
Well, for Hitler, there were laws that if you helped a Jew, if you hid a Jew, if you did anything, you could also be deported. You could be sent to a concentration camp. Hitler wanted to kill all the Jews, basically. So anyone who was caught, if you were caught hiding a Jew, you could be deported along with them. So my father and their stories of rescue are very, very different. My father had an older brother who got to America in '38 and tried to get an affidavit for his parents and brother to come to America, but the list of the queue to come over, there was so long, they weren't allowing enough people. The quotas were restrictive. Anyway, my father then realized, I need a hiding place. Now, what was incredibly hard is to find a hiding place for 3 people. Young people found places, basements, a room here, a few nights there, but he needed a room for his parents and for himself. A friend at the market, my father and his grandfather had a little business buying and selling canned goods, told him to go see a person, and I'm going to show you this picture because I have said often that these people deserve these people here. I'll just show it to you. Mm-hmm. You can put capes on them. These are superheroes. They are super people. They look ordinary, but don't be deceived. Their names are Paul and Laney Pisarius. Working class people, strongly anti-Hitler. So this friend at the market told my father to contact him. My father was afraid. At that time, you didn't know who to trust. He didn't know them from Adam. But time was running out. He had no place to go, and he said, I've got to take a chance. He contacts Paul Pisarius, and he takes him in. Paul and Laney live in the center of Berlin, in an apartment building. They call it a Hinterhaus. It's not right on the street. It's in a courtyard behind. They live on the first floor. They have a small room, roughly 10 by 10, 100 square feet, small for 3 people. Now, when you go, they're now in hiding. When you're in hiding, you don't exist anymore, meaning the German government gave Germans ration cards for food because food was restricted, and it allowed you so much bread, so much butter, whatever per week. But if you're a Jew in hiding, you can't have these cards. You can't go to an authority. You'd be deported. They had 2 cards, but that's not enough for 5 people. So my father frequently had to go out on the market to people he knew and buy food to bring it back to his parents and for himself, which was completely dangerous. So these 2 people took an incredible risk in allowing my father and grandparents to stay in that little room.
Yeah, that was amazing because they not only had to risk hiding them, they had to risk them leaving to get food. They had to, I'm sure, the authorities were watching everyone.
Right.
So that must have been terrifying. So someone to care for another person so much that they're willing to risk their lives
Yeah.
to help them survive is amazing.
He served in World War I. He was the youngest of 8 children. His father was a carpenter. He lived outside of Berlin and then came back to the city afterwards. Worked as sort of a delivery man, bringing goods to different retail shops in Berlin. So he knew people, and he was a good man. I mean, really, we can't praise him high enough. A very, very good man. And there's more to the story that I'll tell you maybe a little later, but he helped my father in many ways. In many ways.
How about your mom's survival story?
My mom had a completely different story of survival. Real quickly, her father had served in the Great War, World War I, and received the Iron Cross First Class, he was extremely proud. And this is him, and he always wore it on his lapel. I know it's hard to see here. He thought that would save him. He felt, I've served my country, I'm a proud German, we're going to be okay here. He was in denial, but he did not believe things the way they happened. So in 1933, Hitler comes to power. People have to leave school. My mother gets to stay in school another year, her and her older brother, because of his service. But after 1 year, no more anyway, so that didn't last long. They go to a Jewish school for a year, and then there's no more school at all. What the government does then, they do something called Zwangsarbeit, which means forced labor. So all Jews have to work someplace. My mom worked at a factory, Siemens, and so did her brother. Anyway, when the deportation started, it started in 1941, the Germans would literally come to the door of German houses and knock on the door. They tried hard, and they succeeded in hiding the truth for many years. They were told, my mother's father and my grandfather and grandmother, that we are just going to resettle you. Pack a suitcase, bring some warm clothes. It's a resettlement now. What they really believed, I'll never know, if I didn't make it, or what they went along. So when they came in 1942 and literally knocked on the door, and they took them to a deportation center. Now my mother and her brother weren't home that day, but when they returned home, they saw a sign on the front door saying, "You must report to this deportation center." Now these were 2 young people, like 20 and 21, and they were not going to do this. They had like a nanny who was not Jewish, and they went to her apartment. She saw them at the door and immediately knew what had happened. She protects them, but there's all this bombing going on in Berlin. I mean, it's a war going on. Her building was bombed. And you can't stay there if you're a person who shouldn't be there to begin with. People are going to ask questions. They have to leave. They wander the streets of Berlin, sleeping at different places. They try to stay in contact. My mother loses contact with her brother. She has no idea where he is. She really, she's lost him. She's walking the streets and somebody calls out her name, "Lilo, Lilo, stop." And my mom is afraid to stop. She's afraid because you can't trust anybody in those period. Well, it turned out to be a schoolmate from her first school. Her name was Eva Kassira. Eva was not Jewish. She was friends with Mom, and she looks at my mother and says, "Do you have a place to sleep?" No. Mom says no. So Eva looks at her, hands her some pocket change, and says, "Come to my house at night when it's dark. Maybe my mother will help you." So my mother has no alternatives, so she goes to that house in the evening. Now, Eva's mother, Hanna Zaczek, is a very wealthy woman. She was now widowed. She was married first to one man, Alfred Kassira. They divorced, and they had a child, Eva, and the father stayed in contact with the child. And then she married again another man, Leo Blumenreich. Hannah was not Jewish, but she married 2 Jewish men, which was interesting. So and they were into art and into collecting. So I also brought a little picture of the house. This is the house. Now this picture, I know it's hard to see here. Should I show it there? Or? Yeah. It's gorgeous, but it was taken after the war because when I go back with Mom to visit, I take that picture. Anyway, so both of these men die in 1932, so they're not around. And basically, Hannah has raised her daughter as a Christian. When Mom comes to the door, Mrs. Utchik agrees to take her in. They give her a new name. They give her, Ava had contacts. They give her ID papers. It's fantastic, except for Mrs. Utchik entertains many Nazis. They are constantly coming in and out of the house, and Mom has to either try to avoid them or stay away or not talk very much, because if those documents were closely examined, they probably wouldn't hold up. So Mrs. Utchik took a lot of risk to take in this Jewish girl into her home, knowing what could happen. So both of these, so actually, skipping ahead, but we have honored both these people and Ava and her mother, what they call righteous among the nations. Righteous among the nations, Israel has designated an honor to people who have helped Jews during the war, and they call that righteous among the nations. And I had submitted years ago an application for both sets, and that was accepted, and I can talk about that later or whenever.
No, that's beautiful, and they definitely deserve to be honored.
Yes. I'm sorry.
I'm just going to say, without certain survival, maybe, I don't know if you wouldn't be here.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
So many other people.
Yes, yeah. I think, in terms of lessons for today, I think they represent a huge lesson. That individuals can still hold on to their morality no matter what the situation is. And sometimes it's very difficult to do that. Sometimes there's so much pressure, either from governments or families, friends, to do a certain way. But if you realize, or if you believe that's wrong, you can follow your own conscience and do what's correct. And that's a difficult thing, and sometimes.
That's so true. And it makes me think about how these stories can help us deal with hatred that comes from, war and prejudice.
That is so hard. That's a really tough question. I think it can't be ignored, meaning I think if you think it'll just go away, you're deceiving yourself. I think it's a constant process of integrating people, integrating thoughts, and connecting to one another. Like for example, I know in our synagogue, our rabbi has a close relationship with other clergy members in the Princeton community, and she tries to foster good relationships between the different churches and the synagogue. And yesterday, let me just tell you this too, there was a march, there was a rally in Washington, D.C. for Israel. It was almost 300,000 people there. And it was basically a rally to say we stand with Israel and bring the hostages home. Now, of course, there were tons of Jewish groups there, but I took pictures. There were signs, Christians for Israel. There were Christian groups there. I saw a priest there. So I saw other groups there as well as Jewish groups at this rally. And we had speakers there, Chuck Schumer, also Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, the recent speaker, was so supportive of Israel. It was fantastic. So we also had a number of family members of the hostages spoke about their situation, and there was some music. So it was a festival of solidarity is really what it was, a festival. So you ask, how do you prevent things like that? I think it's continuous dialogue, and then the isolation and the separation of groups leads to distortions of images. People do not know each other, and they have stereotypes that they've been told. And then when people meet one another, they'll say, wait a minute, that's not at all the way I thought that person would be. But you don't know that unless you have a chance to interact.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about the experiences maybe some of your readers of your book may have told you about, either their experiences or how the book affected them?
The book has been really an interesting reaction. I've given a few talks, and what I find, it opens up floodgates on people who've either had parents or relatives who were in Europe during the Holocaust, and they want to tell their story. They very much want to. Many people also tell me, my parents or whatever, uncles and aunts, never said anything. They never told us, so we don't know what happened. I think a lot of people were so traumatized, they did not want to talk. I'm fortunate in that, number one, my mom, she shared a lot with me. She shared a lot of the story. And through that, I did know a lot of, there was a lot of research on, there were different documents, but in terms of the reaction of people, I think they could relate to it because either they had relatives in a similar situation, and it was keeping those stories alive of the persecution during the Holocaust. And so I think it has had a good reaction. It even received an award. The readers' favorites got the bronze medal for it, which was really nice. My publisher, who was fantastic, Amsterdam Publishing, Lisbeth Henk, can't say enough good things about her, submitted my book for consideration, and it won bronze prize, so that was nice.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
So what do you want your readers to take away from reading your story?
A few things, and this is something I think my father felt. As I said before about maybe prejudice, Germans have a lot to overcome, and I'll put it this way. I think a lot of Jews have trouble with anything German. There's a feeling that I would never go there, I would never buy anything. And yes, the Germans were horrible. The Nazis were horrible. And what they did was unspeakable. It was they wanted to kill all the Jews. It was terrible. However, my father felt this way, and I think he was right. There were some good Germans. Not enough, not nearly enough, but they need to be remembered. That even, and I think this could even happen with the Palestinians and the Israelis. There's going to, whatever hate existed before, I'm afraid whenever this war is over, that hate doesn't go away. You're going to see hate on both sides. And what's so tragic, some of those Israelis who were on the kibbutzim that were attacked, they had actually helped some of the Palestinians go to hospitals and get medical aid in Israel. So they were killing. I'm sure the terrorists didn't know that. They didn't, if they knew, maybe they would not have attacked them. But the point is, there are good Palestinians, and I think it'll take a time, like it's taken a long time for Germany to overcome the horrors of the Holocaust. And it'll take time for the Palestinians to, for the Israelis and the Palestinians to have a better relationship. I think it will come. I hope there'll be a two-state solution. I hope that will come out of this. But it's going to be a challenge.
Yes, I could see that happening. And war is always a challenge, and unfortunately there's so many innocent people who are affected on both sides because of the conflicts. And but it just reminds me why the theme of this show is so important, that you do have stories of love in times of hatred. And we have to remind ourselves of those stories, because every day we hear about the stories of the hate and the suffering. And that has to be mourned. We can't ignore that. But we also have to remember that there are stories of love and compassion. So I just want to let everyone know, if you have any stories where you saw love take place in the midst of hatred, enter them in the comments and share them with others so that we can continue to spread stories of examples of love in times of hate. So if you want to buy this book, you definitely can go to Amazon.com and search for Evelyn Grossman, or the name of the book, Hidden in Berlin. And it would be a great read to have in your library so that you can share with people when you want to show stories of love in times of hatred. So Evelyn, tell me more about any updates to your current work or any future projects or goals.
Well, I want to make an audio version of this book. I've been saying that, and I haven't done that. I've been remiss because there's a whole segment of the population who listens to audiobooks. So that is an immediate goal, to try to get this book into the audio form.
That's great, and I love your voice.
Oh,
it's very calming.
Oh, good.
I think it would be a great listen.
Good. So I'd like that to happen. I'm not a writer by profession, but I've been impressed by the power of the written word to connect to people. This has nothing to do with this book, but I have a daughter who died 6 years ago. She was adult. She was 36.
Sorry to hear that. I'm sorry.
Thank you. She had a cardiac arrhythmia, but she also had a bipolar, and she had ups and downs. She had graduated college, had a master's degree, and she struggled and was doing better, but she had sometimes had slips. I wanted to write short stories. I'm not sure I could do a book, but I need to have her remembered. So I'm going to go through old notes or old letters, and even if they're a couple of pages of different episodes of her life, I think part of writing is to remember the people that were close to you and didn't have a chance to have their story fully told or remembered, which was how I felt about my parents. And I feel that way about Amy, that there was a lot to her. She was creative. She was a painter. She was an art teacher. She ran the marathon in Chicago. She lived in Texas for a while and loved cowboy boots and going to the rodeo. And she could be a hoot and a lot of fun. So I want all that remembered. So that hasn't happened, but that's a goal.
That's beautiful. That's a definite beautiful act of love and compassion on your part. And I think that's something that drives all writers, that they want to either tell a story or explain a situation or a topic that they feel they can support others or enlighten others. And I think the written word is a beautiful way of doing that. So before we end the show, why don't you, this is your opportunity, is there anything you'd like to talk about related to the book that we haven't covered?
Oh, Gil, you've been very kind. Your questions are great. I think we've covered the big points of the book. I think we really have covered the major themes. The book will detail, very briefly, I wanted to explain life for German Jews before Hitler, which was nice, and how things abruptly changed. And then the time of survival, and then coming to America. Coming to America, my parents came in 1948, 10 weeks after coming. No, I think even less, 5 weeks. My father had a job, and my mother too, working in factories. But they were living with my uncle who got here earlier. But the point is, they worked really hard, very hard. I'm a first generation. I think it's a story of coming to America, making a new life, and trying to fit in. I'd always said, I mean, my parents became U.S. citizens 5 years after arriving here, which was as fast as they could possibly do it. And they wanted to be Americans. We went to Niagara Falls, we put those raincoats on, we went the Circle Line boat. We tried to do touristy thing because my father said, well, we're Americans, we should be doing these things. And yet, the German newspaper called the Aufbau came to the house, and my father read it, from front page to last page. It was still inside of him. And there was always because part of his growing up was good times before Hitler came to power. So there was always this bit of a conflict inside. I'm an only child, so my father, we were very close. He died young. He was only 56 years old, and I think about him a lot, actually. So in terms of the whole structure of the book, again, it's before the war, during the war, after the war, coming here. And the last part is we did honor both sets of rescuers as righteous among the nations, and which I was very happy and proud to be able to give them that recognition that they so deserve.
That's beautiful. We appreciate those words, and I encourage everyone to get the book and to also share stories of love in times of hate. So before we end the show, I'd like to say a couple final words. What do we do when we hear or see acts of inhumanity and hate? Well, really the answer is always to show love and compassion. The first is to ourselves. It's really hard to take the burden of tragedies that we don't have direct control over. It's a burden, and it actually will stop us and block us from showing love and compassion. So though we can mourn and have compassion for people suffering, we have to make sure that we don't get engulfed and overtaken by hate and by war. You know, we can donate money with prayerful intentions to support innocent victims, and but because we don't have control over things outside of us or in other countries, we have to accept that we must honor them with love and compassion. But you know, we can show love and compassion to the people close to us. That's another way for us to promote love and compassion and stories of these with the ones closest to us, like our friends and our family. We can even do that to our neighbors and our community and our state and our country. So whatever we have control of, we should try to apply that with love and compassion and doing things for ourselves and for others that will promote that spirit of love. And if we do that, we will create an active energy that helps others with love and compassion, and that will spread to everyone, one person at a time. And then we can constantly see true stories of love and compassion in times of hatred. So I'd like to thank you again, Evelyn, for being on the show.
Thank you, Gil.
I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe, and we look forward to next month's book club. Thank you again, and have a good evening.